I'd like to tell a story about a victim-offender dialogue process that I was involved with as a facilitator or mediator back in the year 2003. And one of the reasons I'd like to tell this story is it provides a good illustration to talk about other kinds of victim-offender dialogues, because what I've noticed over the years of my practice is that just like a human face, there's some common features that you can pick out. Every face has two eyes, two ears, a nose, a mouth. And most cases that involve victims and offenders being brought together for safe, constructive dialogue have some pretty common features in it. At the same time, there's a lot of unique elements to every case, in the same way every human face is different. And the story I want to talk about is a story of revenge that led to some amazing reconciliation and resolution. Before I say some of the details of the story, I want to highlight three different kinds of discussion realms that I've noticed that happen in all restorative dialogues, whether that's mediation or conferencing or circles, lots of different models out there for bringing people together, but they all tend to have the same kind of discussion ingredients. And so these three realms of discussion are what I call the ownership realm, the empathy realm, and the reparation realm. And a little bit later I'll be talking about how they relate to each other, but just bear in mind those three realms, and I'll be using that as a way to illustrate these common features in all dialogues. This story starts out with two young men who were recklessly driving through a rural town on a rainy evening, speeding, and in the eyes of one observer, an older man, felt like it was much too unsafe for the community. So he reported it to the police. The case was brought to the attention. I think he probably knew what the car was and that sort of thing. And through this process of reporting, the two young men somehow were able to find out who had reported them. And within a few weeks, they decided to have some kind of revenge strategy back to him. The older man and his wife lived in some rural property, not too far from the town, but a long driveway, so he was kind of cut off and not really visible. And during a summer month, on 3 different occasions in the evenings, these two young guys went onto the property and did different things without really revealing who they were. The first time they went and they egged some of the windows, both of the guy's house and his vehicle. Another time they went, they noticed that his pickup was open, and they were able to take a few items out of that. And then they came back a third time, again undetected. They noticed that the keys had been left inside the pickup, and so they actually got in the car, drove the pickup off along with their other vehicle, and went to a place where there was a boat launching at a nearby river. It was kind of by a park area. And they parked the pickup there, and they had their other vehicle nearby, and were kind of fooling around, talking. And one of them looked at the other and kind of nodded and said, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" And the other was saying, "Yeah, let's do it." And they basically put the pickup in neutral and allowed it to go down this boat ramp that went straight into the river, which was deep enough so when they let the pickup go all the way in, it fully submerged under the water. So that's kind of the first scene of this whole story. These two guys who were speeding in town felt like they needed to take some kind of revenge action back to this older man, and did what they did to the pickup. I'll fast forward now. Eventually the police got involved, and the two young guys were, it wasn't too hard to kind of figure it out in a small rural area that they were responsible for this offense. And so both of them were processed by the law through the justice system. And I happened to work with one of them who was 18 at the time. The other one was a little older. And it's interesting eventually to compare how both of them had very different justice processes. But the one who was 18 that I worked with was able to go through a community-based restorative justice program that had a victim offender mediation component to that program. One of the important things before bringing victims and offenders together is to have enough preparation so that as a mediator or facilitator, you can really predict a positive outcome. The last thing you want to do is bring people together in an unpredictable situation where there might be more harm or things might be said that just cause more of a strain. There's already huge mistrust between the parties. And so you really want to make sure as a mediator or facilitator that you're creating the right preparations to bring folks together. And so I met with the young man and his father, and we had a good discussion about his sense of ownership. I was amazed how much remorse he was already expressing and really felt bad. I think he was getting to the point where he felt like, why did I do something that stupid? And was reflecting a lot on himself as that's not the kind of person I want to be when I grow older. And so, unlike some of the other offenders I've worked with over time, he really wanted to take this opportunity to make amends and was apologetic and began to work on imagining what kinds of amends could he do. So he was on board in a good way to go the next step to a joint resolution dialogue meeting. Then I contacted the victim and called him up. He really hadn't had any other contact with the justice system. And when I first called him and introduced who I was, and I was part of a mediation program, he said, "Mediation? What's that about?" He was very mad. He hadn't really had a chance to tell anyone how his life had been affected by all of this, and so he was kind of in a waiting mode, what's the system going to do? But when he found out that there was this mediation opportunity, he even got more mad. Like, why would I even want to meet with a guy who did all of this to me? What's the sense in that? I want some kind of punishment and know that, he's being taken care of. So I had to, it was kind of an interesting situation because I called him from my home. I had to lock myself in my bathroom so my children, who were very young at the time, couldn't bother me. And I recall listening for about 15 minutes, giving this older man a chance to just talk about how he had been affected by the situation. And he went on and on. He lost his keys because he was a school janitor. He lost special property that was in the pickup that got wrecked. He never really got the pickup back. He talked about the hassles of having to have a rental car. It was just an endless list of impacts that he described to me. And all I could do is listen to him and validate. That must have really been a frustrating situation. And he still felt kind of resistant to the whole idea of participating in our process. And I finally said to him, it sounds like you just want these guys to be held accountable in a way that's meaningful to you and that really makes a difference. And he said, yeah, that's exactly what I want. And I said, well, that's a big part of what our process really allows, is we give the space in order for that to happen. And you can say whatever you want, express your feelings. And he said, well, then I'm all for it. When do we meet? So after he agreed to go through our process, I was thankful for that because it seemed like a good case. When the offender is voluntarily saying, I want to do this, you want to make sure a victim is feeling good about doing it voluntarily. So we were able to set up a joint meeting that would happen in the rural town. I had to schedule in like a community center place where we could meet. And the young man's father came to this meeting and was prepared to come, and the victim's wife came. And typically I work with a co-mediator, but in this case I was alone. So there were 5 of us that met for this joint dialogue opportunity. We came together and I think it took about 2 hours to cover everything. That's not untypical for a case that's got a lot of things to talk about. And I you know, I went over some preliminaries and then explained how we're going to talk about what happened. You're going to have a chance to tell your story. We're going to have a time for all of the impacts and losses to be discussed, and then we're going to have a chance to create some agreements, some restitution agreements or any other kinds of resolutions that need to happen. And both of, what I've seen is that these three areas of an outline, what happened, what are the impacts, how can things be repaired, really fit nicely with the concept of ownership, empathy, and reparation. It gives people a sense of really covering all of the bases in a restorative dialogue. And I had the offender go first. I said, please tell whatever you want to say to describe your situation. And what was nice is that he had prepared a letter of apology that he literally read. He unfolded it. He read this letter of how he had no idea how this would really affect the victim's life. He talked a bit about, you know, why he did it, and then felt really bad about it. And what was really powerful to me to watch was, you know, after he finished it, he took the letter and he handed it to the victim. The victim took it, and I could really tell that that was a gesture that was meaningful for the victim. And then I said to the victim, do you have some questions that you'd like to ask? And he did. He had tons of questions that really weren't answered by any other means of information. And so he mostly wanted to ask, like, where are my keys? He had a huge wad of keys as a school janitor, and actually the offender had still had them in his possession and never turned them in, and so that was kind of a relief for the victim to find that out. He asked a lot of questions about the other offender and wanted to know, like, how is he taking this? Does he have as much ownership and remorse as you do? And so there was some information given about that. Other questions came up, but what I was mindful of is that as the victim was asking these questions, he really was leading up to just telling his story. And so I finally said, why don't you just talk about how this has affected you and start wherever you want. And so the old man began to talk about how when he first found out about this, found out that he didn't have a car, he really had a hard situation, because a lot of those keys, being a school janitor, just weren't easily and quickly replaced. He had to get a rental car that was kind of a hassle. He talked about a number of possessions that were damaged and he never got back. Some of them were special things that you don't just replace by buying them again, but they had a special history for him. I think one of them was some golf shoes and things like that. And I noticed that the offender repeatedly had opportunity to say, I'm sorry. And I've seen a number of times that early on an offender might say, you know, might make an apology, but when they start making a third or fourth apology on the basis of new things they're learning, it really indicates that they're getting it, and it communicates to the victim, they're hearing me. And I was thankful for that. The victim's wife had a chance to talk about how she was affected. You know, a big part of this was learning that these guys had come on their property, and, you know, not only did the egging and took away the pickup, but also created a certain kind of mistrust. And other neighbors had heard about it, and so they're starting to lock their houses when they hadn't locked their houses before, and there's just this ripple effect that mistrust can create often. And then the young man talked about consequences for his life. The father talked about how it affected their family life. And one of the things that I try to do when there is this discussion around the impacts and consequences is I invite, especially the offender, I say, can you echo back some of the things that you're hearing or learning? And when they're able to name some of the exact things, sometimes even using the words that the victim used, talking and looking right at them when they say it, like, you know, you mentioned this, you mentioned that. It really creates a strong empathy. And that's really a concept that just involves people connecting with the common humanity of the other person. The more that bridge work happens in a restorative dialogue, it gets people to the point where they're moving from a mistrust to a trusting posture. And that's kind of getting over the summit. You know, whatever is difficult or tense at the beginning of a conversation, when they hit those points of empathy and understanding, it helps them get over that summit. And it's a lot easier then to get into the reparation and resolution discussion. So finally, toward the end of those 2 hours, we got into what needs to be done to make things right, to repair things. And I asked the victim, you know, what are you wanting? What kinds of things would make sense to you for things to really be fully repaired? And he had a number of things already listed out. I mean, one of them that I mentioned earlier is he wanted his keys back. Another interesting one was he said, you know, the pickup got pulled out of the river and was put into an impound lot. But he looked at the young man and he said, you know, when you took my vehicle, it actually became yours. And I'm not going to pay for all of the costs that it took, you know, to have it stored there or to get it out. So I want you to be responsible for that. And that made sense to the young man. There was also just a restitution cost for the value of the pickup. And so that got written into the agreement. And an apology letter to some other folks that weren't there was part of it. And so all of these things eventually get written down into an agreement that both parties can sign to, and it's a way after the dialogue to just, for people to know actions can really back up words is a big part of what these agreements are all about. But then I turned to the young man and I said, is there anything in addition you'd like to do that hasn't really been put out on the table yet? And the first thing he said was, he looked at the old man and he said, well, I'd be willing to come and do any outdoor work you might have on your property. And when I first heard that, I kind of thought, whoa, you know, that's a pretty daring kind of thing to say, where a relationship was only defined by mistrust, and you know, they had a negative relationship from the start regarding the speeding, the revenge motive, and then the whole pickup incident. And so I was kind of nervous about how that request might have affected the old man. But this is the first thing that he said: I've got some wood out back. And it really touched me to know that immediately, because of the kinds of resolution that was happening in the dialogue, the victim was already envisioning a potential restoration process that involved not just some physical work on his property, you know, where the younger guy would come and chop wood and help stack it, but that they could potentially even have a relationship building in a context that's not overseen. There's no police or probation officer that comes with these kinds of things that get mutually worked out between a victim and an offender. And so the fifth agreement of 5 final agreements that got written down was for him to come and do a certain number of hours on this man's property regarding some wood chopping and stacking. And so that really brings it kind of to an end. Empathy is something that creates a greater motivation for the reparation. And sometimes in our society, we're all hardwired to think that once you've established what the problem is, let's just fix it. You know, so if we know that there's ownership, let's just figure out the reparation and we'll be done with it. And even in a more of a conventional legal process, that means once we've established guilt, let's just figure out what the punishment is and move it on. But a restorative process wants to take a longer route. It wants to go from that ownership through a discussion that builds empathy to get to a richer kind of reparation. And that's where the real learning happens in that empathy stage. It's where the aha moment can come, often for an offender when they don't realize how much their actions have affected another person. It's where they can internalize more of what they're experiencing and hearing, to the point where they then have a true internal motivation to repair the harm, rather than what I call just an external motivation because they're told to do something, or it's expected for them, or they even have a disincentive if they don't do a reparation. They have a disincentive. Restorative justice wants that positive motivation to really come from the heart, from an offender, so that they're going to make amends, apologize, not repeat their offenses, work on some of their own cognitive issues so that they're not prone to negative behaviors in the future. And this is really part of what creates a type of change opportunity, a real transformation that comes out of these dialogue processes. It's really hitting the heart of an offender, and that hits the heart of a victim. And when the community is involved, they feel that heart process bringing about something better. So just to wrap up everything here that I've been talking about, a dialogue process that really gives space, a safe space for ownership and true apology, just to be openly and honestly acknowledged, leads naturally to a discussion where empathy and understanding can be built between parties. It humanizes them. It really lets them see that everyone has needs and a desire not to just be stuck with the negative stuff of the past. And then that, once that's full, leads to a natural discussion around resolution and reparation. Nice path between the past, the present, and the future. And frankly, if a justice process doesn't really allow people to go fully from the past to the future and allow them to shift away from the, whatever holds them captive to things in the past, real justice has not been done if people are still captivated by the past. And good restorative work, whether it's a circle process, a conference, a mediation, whatever it is going to make sure there's a fullness that lets people go from the past to the future through that deep learning, that deep human connection that truly allows people to move forward.